December 1933, Tokyo Arsenal, Japan. The morning air carries the scent of oil and rain. Inside a dimly lit hangar, hammers strike steel in slow rhythm, not violence, but creation. A small team of engineers gathers around a model tank no larger than a child's toy. Their hands are black with grease, their faces lit by the cold light of winter. They do not know it yet, but what they are building will carry a nation's pride into the fires of war. They call it the Type 95 Heigo. Japan was changing. The world was moving toward mechanized war, and the empire could feel the ground shifting beneath its feet. In Europe, new tanks rolled across proving grounds. German Panzer prototypes, British Matildas, Soviet T-26. But on the islands of Japan, progress came differently. The nation had ambition, but not the industry to match it. Steel was scarce, fuel was precious, and yet the generals wanted speed, mobility, firepower that could reach deep into China's vast landscapes. They turned to their engineers, men who had learned to create miracles with little more than willpower and scrap metal. Among them was Tomio Hara, a quiet man with sharp eyes and oil-stained fingers. Hara believed machines could embody a spirit, that a tank was more than armor and rivets. It was an expression of purpose. He once said, "The tank must be light enough to cross a rice field, but strong enough to carry a soldier's faith." It was a poetic dream in a brutal time. Under Hara's direction, the project moved quickly. The Hago would be small, agile, and simple enough to build in numbers. It would have 3 crewmen, a commander, a gunner, and a driver. Its armor would be thin, just 12 millimeters at its thickest point, barely more than the width of a coin. Its gun, a 37-meter Type 94 cannon, could pierce through enemy light vehicles, but not much more. It was not a tank of power, it was a tank of belief. In March 1934, the first Hago prototype rumbled to life on the test fields near Sagamihara. Its diesel engine coughed, then steadied into a rhythmic growl. Officers in heavy coats stood watching, notebooks in hand, as the small machine glided over the frost. To them, it was a symbol, proof that Japan could create something modern, something that moved with the speed of progress. When the test ended, silence fell across the field. The officers nodded in approval. The Hago had passed. Within a year, it entered production, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army. For the crews who first climbed into its steel shell, the Hago was more than a vehicle. It was a companion, a home, a symbol of everything they believed Japan could become. They called it Kurogane no Sensha, the Iron Tank. Some whispered nicknames like Little Dragon or Child of the Emperor. In the barracks, men memorized its controls like prayer. The sound of its engine became a song they could not forget, the hum of duty, the rhythm of destiny. When they looked at its steel plates, they didn't see thin armor. They saw courage. They believed no bullet could defeat a soul devoted to the emperor. It was faith forged in metal. Japan's military strategy of the 1930s was built on that faith. In doctrine meetings in Tokyo, generals spoke of seishin, the fighting spirit, as a weapon mightier than steel. To them, the Hago's speed and maneuverability were perfect for Asia's terrain. The enemy, they reasoned, would never match Japan's discipline or devotion. And in those early years, it seemed they were right. The Hago first saw battle in Manchuria and northern China, where the Imperial Army met warlords and outdated Chinese forces. The tank's light frame moved effortlessly through muddy roads and rice paddies. Chinese defenses, mostly rifles and machine guns, bounced harmlessly off its armor. Reports flooded back to Tokyo. The Hago performs beyond expectation. Each victory added to the myth. Crews wrote home describing their tanks as invincible, unstoppable, the future of Japan's glory. Factories expanded. By 1938, hundreds of Hagos rolled off the production lines, their riveted hulls painted in yellow-green camouflage, their rising sun insignia shining under factory lights. In every photograph from that time, the men beside them are smiling, proud, certain. But beyond the horizon, a different kind of war was taking shape. The Soviet Union had learned from Spain and Germany. Its new BT-7s and T-26 carried thicker armor and heavier guns. The Americans were experimenting with machine guns that could pierce light steel at distance. And in Europe, the panzers were evolving, faster, stronger, armored like beasts. Japan didn't see it yet. In their victories across Asia, the Hago seemed unstoppable. But history was already writing the next chapter, one that would test every assumption the empire had built. In late 1938, a Hago platoon commander named Sergeant Kameda wrote in his journal, "Our tanks move like wind through the fields. When the sun rises behind us, the light strikes their armor like gold. We feel invincible." He would take those words into the Mongolian plains months later at Khalkhin Gol and never return. For now, the illusion still held. In the silence before the storm, Japan's tank crews believed they were the vanguard of a new age, the iron edge of an empire, destined to rule the Pacific. In the workshops of Osaka and Nagoya, engineers tightened the last bolts on new Hagos, unaware that the very lightness they celebrated would one day become their downfall. The hum of the factories, the smell of oil and sweat. It was all part of Japan's heartbeat in those years, a rhythm of faith disguised as progress. No one questioned it. No one doubted. The empire was moving forward, and the Hago was leading the way. But war never moves in one direction, and the road ahead was darker than anyone could imagine. Before the fire, there is always silence. Before the storm, always belief. And in that stillness, beneath the rising sun painted on steel, the Hago waited. May 1939, the Mongolian steppe stretches endless under a pale sky. Dust swirls around a column of Japanese tanks advancing toward the Khalkhin Gol River. Engines hum. Antennas whip in the wind. To the men inside, this is another campaign, another easy victory for the empire. They do not yet know that the world beyond these plains is no longer standing still, and that today their faith in the Hago will be tested and broken. War had taught Japan confidence. From Shanghai to Nanking, the Hago had seemed unstoppable. Swift, precise, and loyal. But the battles in China were not the full measure of modern war. They were fought against ill-equipped foes, armies built on courage, not machines. At Khalkhin Gol, Japan met something different, the Red Army. It began as a border skirmish, a dispute over empty land between Mongolia and Manchuria. No one expected it to grow into one of the largest tank battles before World War II. But in the summer of 1939, under the command of Georgy Zhukov, the Soviets brought something Japan had not yet faced: modern armor. The BT-5s and BT-7s rolled like thunder across the grasslands. They were fast, heavily armed, and wrapped in armor the Hago's 30-centimeter guns could barely scratch. When they came in silence, a low rumble rising like a storm under the horizon. Sergeant Kameda, who once wrote of his invincible little dragon, would later describe the first contact in his diary. "The ground shook before we heard the guns. I saw a flash and the Hago beside me vanished in fire. I had never seen armor burn like that." His words were found months later in a damaged notebook pulled from the wreckage. The Hago was built for speed, not survival. Its thin plating that once deflected rifle fire now tore apart under Soviet shells. Crews realized with terrible clarity that what they'd thought was protection was little more than painted hope. Bullets that once bounced now punched clean through. Even machine gun rounds, the 12.7mm DSK, ripped through its sides like paper. Inside the cramped hulls, the sound was deafening. The ringing of ricochets, the screams of splintered metal, the smell of burning oil and human skin. In the open fields of Mongolia, there was no jungle to hide in, no darkness to escape into, only sunlight and steel. The Soviets fought with cold precision. They used coordinated tank and artillery fire, supported by aircraft, tactics Japan had never faced. Zhukov's men treated tanks as a system, not as symbols. For Japan, the Hago was a warrior's blade. For the Soviets, the tank was an instrument, but mechanical, ruthless, efficient. The difference was devastating. Entire platoons of Hagos disappeared under shell fire. Their crews fought bravely, often refusing to abandon their machines until the last moment. Some charged forward, even after losing their guns, trying to ram Soviet armor. A handful succeeded, most did not. When the smoke cleared, hundreds of Japanese tanks lay burning across the plains. And for the first time, the empire faced an undeniable truth: faith was not armor. The news reached Tokyo in fragments. reports written in restrained, formal language, the tone hiding the disaster beneath. Severe resistance met, mechanical losses heavy. Morale remained strong. Behind those words lay the graves of men who believed too much in machines that could not protect them. Tomio Hara received one of those reports personally. He read it alone in his office, the pages trembling in his hand. He had built the Hago with pride, a weapon born from constraint, not ignorance. He knew its limits, but now he saw what belief had done, how soldiers had been sent into the open with nothing more than faith between them and death. Hara wrote in his private notes, "The spirit of the soldier is strong, but steel must be stronger." It was the first time he admitted doubt. Back at the front, the survivors of Khalkhin Gol limped home. Many had burns on their hands and faces from escaping through the hatch. Others spoke little, staring at nothing, their silence heavier than their medals. They had seen the myth break. They had felt it splinter around them in fire and sound. One lieutenant recalled, "When the bullet hit, I felt the tank breathe. It inhaled heat and exhaled death. He survived. His driver did not." That summer, the Hago's reputation changed. No longer invincible, merely useful. A fast machine for the jungles and colonies, perhaps, but never again for the open battlefield. The Japanese command drew its own lessons. Avoid tank duels, strike fast and vanish before the enemy could respond. It was a tactical adaptation, but not a spiritual one. They did not yet accept that the world had moved beyond them. In the years that followed, Japan refined its light tanks, the Type 97 Tiki, the Chiha medium tank. But the core philosophy remained. Speed over strength, spirit over steel. It had worked before. It would, they hoped, work again. Factories resumed production. Young recruits still trained in Hagos, crawling through narrow hatches, learning to see the world through a narrow slit of glass, and courage. The war in China dragged on, the empire expanded. And the lesson of Khalkhin Gol, the lesson written in fire, was quietly buried beneath propaganda and pride. In the small towns of Japan, families still received letters filled with pride and certainty. "Mother," one tanker wrote, "our Hago is fast as wind. When we move, the enemy cannot touch us." He wrote that in 1941, somewhere in Malaya. He didn't know yet what awaited him, that soon the enemy would not only touch him, but tear through him like light through paper. For now the empire slept in its illusion once more. Proud, determined, unaware that a new war was about to ignite, one that would stretch from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of the Pacific. And when it came, the Hago would return to the front, not as the instrument of destiny, but as a relic of misplaced faith. Every empire builds its myth upon something fragile. For Japan it was this, that courage could outlast technology. At Khalkhin Gol, that belief cracked for the first time. But the echo of its breaking was drowned by the march of war. December 8, 1941, northern Malaya. The dawn mist hangs low over the jungle canopy. Engines whisper through the trees, not Allied but Japanese. The empire of the rising sun has moved, and at the tip of its spear rolls the Type 95 Hago. The world changed overnight. Japan struck across the Pacific like a storm that had waited too long to break. Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. From the coasts of Malaya to the rice fields of the Philippines, tanks that once sat idle in Manchuria now thundered through palm groves and mountain trails. The Hago led the way, light, swift, unstoppable, or so it seemed. The early triumphs in, the first months of war, the Hago became a symbol of Japanese momentum. Its tracks carved paths through jungles the Allies thought impassable. British commanders, schooled in European warfare, had dismissed the terrain as tank-proof. But they were wrong. The Type 95's light frame, just 7 tons of steel, became its greatest weapon. It floated over mud where heavier tanks sank. It crossed bridges the British never thought would hold armor. And when it appeared from the tree line, gun blazing, it carried not just shells, but fear. At Jitra, at Kampar, and down the long road to Singapore, the Hago fought with audacity. Small crews, often 3 men, sometimes only 2, maneuvered like hunters. Their engines roared, their guns flashed, and in the confusion of retreat, British lines broke. In those days, Japanese tank crews believed they were invincible. They were not arrogant, only certain of their purpose. To them, the Hago was not just a machine, it was proof of Japan's destiny. Across the seas from the jungles of Malaya, the Hago rolled next to the Philippines. There, under the tropical sun, it met the American M3 Stuart, another light tank, faster and better armed. For the first time, the Japanese crews hesitated. They saw a mirror of themselves, another light tank, another young crew, fighting with the same desperation. The clashes were brutal and close. Tanks stalked each other through sugarcane and smoke. Sometimes they fought at ranges, so near the men inside could hear the shouts of their enemies. But for a time, the Hago held its ground, not through superiority, but through cunning. Japanese commanders ambushed with precision, striking at weak flanks, using terrain like a weapon. Each victory came at a price, but it was victory all the same. The myth of invincibility. By early 1942, the empire had stretched from Burma to the Solomons. Maps in Tokyo glowed with red banners of conquest. The Type 95 was celebrated in newspapers, drawn in heroic posters, praised as the chariot of the emperor's soldiers. But beneath the triumph, a quiet truth began to surface, one that few dared to speak. Reports trickled in from the front. Bullets that pierced armor, shells that ripped through the hull, engines catching fire under the tropical heat. The Hago was fast, but fragile. A 12-millimeter armor plate was enough to stop rifle rounds, but not much more. American .50 caliber bullets tore through its side. British 2-pounder guns punched clean holes through its front. Even anti-tank rifles, wielded by desperate defenders, found their mark. Inside those thin walls, the men learned the true weight of steel and the limits of their faith. The human cost tank warfare for the Japanese was not the vast armored chessboard of Europe. It was personal, close. Every battle was a knife fight between steel beasts in the jungle shadows. Crews spoke of the suffocating heat inside the Hago, the stench of oil and sweat, the engine's roar so loud it drowned out prayer. When hit, there was no room to escape. No heavy armor to protect them, no space to survive a shell burst. The tank became a coffin of fire. Yet they kept fighting, out of duty, out of belief, out of something deeper, the unspoken understanding that their deaths were not their own, but part of a greater design. Burma, the edge of endurance in the thick jungles of Burma. The myth of the Hago met the cruelty of reality. The British had learned. The terrain that once favored Japan now became a trap. Mines, ambushes, artillery. The jungle that once hid the hunter now swallowed him whole. Many Hagos were abandoned, half buried in mud, engines seized by heat and humidity. Some crews set them aflame rather than let them fall into enemy hands. For the first time, Japanese soldiers began to whisper that the machine they had trusted was not invincible, only mortal. Still, their courage did not fade. In those narrow trails and forgotten valleys, the Type 95 fought to the last breath, not because it could win, but because surrender was never written into its steel. One veteran later recalled, "When the armor cracked, I saw daylight through the wall. I knew then. The tank was not protecting me. I was protecting it. Reflection, the fire had spread across oceans, across nations, across the hearts of men. But even as Japan triumphed, the seeds of its undoing were already taking root." The same courage that carried the Hago forward would soon face the full weight of American steel. In the silence after each victory, a question lingered. How long could belief stand against the truth of metal? Narrator, closing line. The Empire's light tank had conquered the jungle. But the jungle was not the world, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a new kind of war machine was awakening. June 15, 1944, Saipan. The sea burns red at dawn. American shells fall like thunder from beyond the horizon. In the island's hills, a lone Type 95 Hago sits in silence. Its crew waits, 3 men in a world that is ending. The war had changed. Once the Hago was the blade that cut through jungles. Now it was the shield, dented, thin, and trembling under fire it could not withstand. By 1943, Japan's expansion had halted. Guadalcanal had been lost. The American war machine, vast, methodical, and merciless, was awakening. For the first time, the empire that had conquered so much began to fight, not for victory, but for time. shadows of defeat. The Hago was never meant for this kind of war. Against the Sherman, a beast of twice its weight and 10 times its armor, it was like a sparrow facing a storm. Crews learned quickly that to survive meant to vanish. They hid their tanks in gullies, under trees, camouflaged with branches and mud. The enemy always found them. At night, the sky glowed with the fire of naval bombardments. The earth shook, and when morning came, the Hago crawled from the ruins like a wounded animal. Every engine cough, every track grind carried the sound of desperation. A letter never sent. In a fragment found decades later, a scorched notebook near the ruins of a Hago on Saipan, a few words remained legible. Mother, the tank smells of oil and smoke. When the engine starts, it shakes like it is afraid. The others say we will stop them here. I do not know if that is true. The nights are long. I think of the mountains of home. He never signed his name. That letter, blackened by flame, outlasted the man who wrote it. His tank was found half buried, its hatch welded shut by heat. The sound of steel breaking on Saipan, the Hagos waited in ambush. 36 tanks facing hundreds of American Shermans. When the battle began, it was over in minutes. The thin armor that once deflected small arms fire shattered under 75mm shells. Engines exploded. Turrets were torn away. One survivor later recalled the tank shook like it screamed. The fire moved faster than thought. I heard the gunner calling, but there was no air left to answer. Inside the Type 95, death was instant, or it was unbearable. The metal that once carried pride now carried ghosts. Burma, the forgotten front. Far from the Pacific Islands, in the jungles of Burma, other Hagos still fought. They battled not against Shermans, but against time and terrain. Mud swallowed their tracks, engines failed. Fuel convoys never arrived. Still, they fought, out of duty, out of habit, out of the old illusion that courage could outweigh steel. At Meiktila and Mandalay, the British closed in. Japanese tankers, exhausted, half-starved, used their tanks as bunkers, firing until their guns melted. Some crews tied grenades to their belts, choosing to die beside their machines rather than surrender. To them, the tank was not just a weapon. It was a home, a promise, a grave they had built with their own hands. The human silence, there are no great records of the men inside those tanks. No grand speeches, only fragments, journal entries, official reports, burned letters. But through those fragments, a truth emerges. They were not fearless. They were young. They were afraid. The Hago, once a symbol of the empire's ambition, had become a symbol of its sacrifice. Each burned wreck on the battlefield was not just a failure of design, it was a story of men who believed until belief itself broke. The dying machine, by late 1944, the Type 95 was obsolete. Its gun could no longer pierce Allied armor. Its engine failed under the tropical heat. Its crews fought on, knowing the machine beneath them belonged to another war. In the Philippines, they drove their Hagos into hopeless battles. Some charged into columns of Shermans with engines aflame, suicide attacks of steel and smoke. Others waited in silence, ambushing supply trucks, fighting not for victory but for memory. Every Hago destroyed was a chapter closed. Every burning wreck marked the end of an era that had once promised eternity. The last broadcast. In a radio transmission intercepted by U.S. forces near Leyte, a Japanese officer was heard speaking softly before static consumed the signal. No emotion in his voice, only finality. The tanks are gone. The road is gone. I have 3 men left. Tell the Emperor, we did not retreat. We only disappeared. The message was never repeated. Hours later, the entire unit was wiped out by artillery fire. Reflection. When the guns fell silent and the jungle reclaimed the wreckage, the Type 95 Hago remained, rusting beneath vines and rain. What once symbolized Japan's rise now lay broken in the soil of distant islands. But perhaps even in ruin, it kept its dignity. Each tank became a monument, not of conquest, but of conviction. The men inside did not live to see their empire fall. They never saw the world rebuilt, but their story, the story of belief meeting the limits of steel, endures. Narrator, closing line. Once, the Hago carried the empire's dreams across the Pacific. Now it rests in silence, a shell of memory, half buried in the earth it tried to conquer. And in that silence, one truth remains. War remembers the men who fought, even when the world forgets their names. Tokyo, February 1945. Snow drifts over the city's broken skyline. Somewhere beneath the ruins, a handful of engineers work by lamplight, hands trembling with cold and exhaustion. Outside, the sky glows red, not from sunrise, but from fire. The empire has entered its long night. The war that had begun with thunder now whispered through the ruins. Japan, once unstoppable, once proud, had been pushed to the edge of its endurance. The Type 95 Heigo, that small defiant tank that had led the empire's advance, was now fighting a war it could not understand. In the jungles of the Philippines, on the islands of the Marianas, in the crumbling outskirts of China, the Hago still rolled, though there was little left for it to defend. Its armor, once polished and proud, now bore the scars of endless defeat. Its tracks cut through mud, not with purpose, but with memory. Factories in the the industrial heart of Japan, the factories that had once forged tanks in their thousands, now stood hollow. Air raids came nightly, the rumble of B-29s above like a promise of ending, windows shattered, steel twisted. The smell of burning oil clung to everything, and yet, in corners untouched by flame, men still worked. They salvaged engines from wrecks. They stripped copper from power lines to repair transmissions. Some used melted-down aircraft parts to patch armor. There were no illusions left. Each tank that rolled out of those workshops was a shadow of its former self, a ghost made of fragments and will. Still, they built them, not because they believed in victory, but because work gave them meaning, a small defiance against the darkness that had swallowed everything else. Voices of the fallen in the ruins of Manila. A Japanese tanker wrote in his journal, "I have seen the world turn to ash." The tank is older than I am. When I start the engine, it coughs like a dying man. But when it moves, I feel alive again. Perhaps that is enough. He was 19. His body was never found. These voices, quiet, human, fading, are the true record of the empire's end. Not the speeches, not the orders, but the thoughts of young men trying to hold on to something real while the world burned away. The engineers. For the engineers who designed the Heigo a decade earlier, the war had turned into a nightmare of reflection. They watched as their creation, once celebrated as a triumph of Japanese ingenuity, was now slaughtered on every front. Each report that reached Tokyo read like an obituary. Destroyed by airstrike. Penetrated by .50 caliber. Crew lost in action. One engineer, Robert L. Hall's Japanese counterpart, Kumagai Hiroshi, chief designer at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, was said to have stood silently at his drafting table long after production had ceased. He looked down at the blueprint of the Hago, its thin lines of armor, its graceful turret ring, its simple machine gun port, and whispered, "It was never meant for this." The endless retreat across the Pacific Islands, remnants of Japanese forces dug in, waiting for invasions they knew they couldn't repel. Fuel was gone, ammunition scarce. Some crews buried their tanks up to the turret, turning them into stationary bunkers. Others removed the engines and used the hulls as makeshift shelters. When the Americans landed, there was no charge left in the Empire's steel. Only isolated bursts of resistance, fierce, brief, doomed. The Hago, once a symbol of progress, now sat rusting under palm trees, its gun pointing toward a sky filled with American planes. The Hago's last battle on Okinawa, April 1945, a handful of Hagos made their final stand. They rolled through smoke and shattered coral, engines rattling, crews whispering prayers beneath their breath. Against Shermans, flame tanks, and naval bombardment, they never had a chance. When the last one was hit, the explosion could be seen from the coast. It burned for hours, a pyre for all that had come before. Later, when U.S. soldiers approached the wreck, they found 3 helmets neatly lined beside it and a folded flag half buried in the sand. Someone had placed it there before the fire took hold. The weight of silence after the battles ended. Silence returned, but not peace. Across Japan, mothers waited for letters that would never come. In villages once proud of their sons in uniform, only absence remained. The Hago had been a machine of war, but to those who built it, repaired it, and rode inside it, it was more than that. It was memory, of belief, of loss, of a generation swallowed by history. The war had taken everything from them, their land, their strength, their dreams, yet in the quiet, something human remained. Reflection. When historians speak of war, they count victories and losses. They measure production, range, armor thickness, but those numbers cannot capture the sound of a dying engine or the look in a young man's eyes when he realizes he will not see another sunrise. The Type 95 Hago began as a promise that speed and courage could triumph over steel. It ended as a whisper that nothing built by man can outrun time. Narrator closing line. In the final winter of war, the Hago stood where everything else had fallen, not as a weapon, but as a witness, and in its rust and ruin, it carried the last heartbeat of an empire that had forgotten how to dream. August 15, 1945, Tokyo. The radio crackles with the emperor's voice. Calm, trembling, unlike anything the nation has ever heard. In the silence that follows, the empire vanishes. Factories fall still. Soldiers lower their flags. Engineers stand among the ruins of what they built. The war is over, but memory is not. When peace finally came, it did not arrive like a dawn. It came like smoke, slow, uncertain, choking what was left of a broken nation. Japan had surrendered. Its cities lay in ruins, and in those ashes the truth began to surface. The Type 95 Hago, once a proud symbol of Japan's technological spirit, now sat rusting in jungles and scrapyards across Asia. In the Philippines, children climbed inside the empty hulls. In Burma, farmers used the metal for plows. And in Tokyo, the men who had designed it gathered to answer questions no one wanted to ask. The engineers' silence. In a small room in the Ministry of Munitions, a tribunal convened. Not to assign blame, not exactly, but to understand how an empire had been built on such fragile steel. Kumagai Hiroshi, the lead designer, spoke softly, almost mechanically. The Hago was made for speed, not survival. We knew its armor was thin, but it was all we could build with what we had. He paused. His hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses. We did not design it for conquest. We designed it for defense, for soldiers who would fight far from home. The record shows that he looked down at the table and whispered something inaudible. Some said it was an apology. Others said it was a prayer. The truth in the archives. Years later, as Allied intelligence combed through captured Japanese files, they found production records, field reports, and internal memos. Among them were chillingly honest assessments. Armor insufficient. Crew casualties high. Morale dependent on belief. The documents revealed a quiet truth the empire had hidden, that by 1943, Japan's engineers knew their tanks were obsolete, but to admit it was treason. So they pressed on, building more Hagos, sending them to battles they could never survive. It was not malice, it was momentum, the unstoppable weight of duty that drives nations long after reason has fled. Survivors' testimonies. In the years after the war, a few tankers returned home. They carried no medals, no glory, only silence. Some never spoke of what they'd seen. Others, in rare moments of confession, offered glimpses into their truth. One former gunner interviewed in 1952 said, "When the Americans came, we were already ghosts. The tank shook like it remembered every man who died inside it. I do not hate it. I still dream of the sound of the engine. It was our heartbeat." He lived the rest of his life as a teacher in Osaka, never mentioning his service again. But his students remembered a quiet man who sometimes paused in mid-sentence as if listening to something far away, perhaps the echo of tracks in the mud. The Western eye in America, military analysts studied the Hago with detached curiosity. At Aberdeen Proving Ground, one was disassembled, its armor tested, its design compared to Allied machines. To them it was primitive, a relic of an earlier age. They noted its flaws, its weak engine, its poor visibility. But one observer wrote in the margin of his report, "What it lacks in power, it makes up for in spirit." Even the victors, in the quiet of their laboratories, seemed to sense the humanity embedded in its steel. Haunted by purpose for Japan's engineers, the reckoning was not about guilt alone. It was about meaning. They had built machines of war, but in their minds, they had been builders of protection, not destruction. When the U.S. occupation government redirected Japanese industry toward peace, many of those same men helped design Japan's first post-war vehicles, trucks, trains, machines to carry life instead of ending it. Yet, in every drawing, every rivet, every sound of a turning engine, some of them still heard the ghost of the Hago, the hum of an old belief that never fully died. The museum in 1958, a rusted Type 95 was recovered from the jungles of Luzon and shipped to a military museum in Tokyo. It sat on display, silent and battered, its paint flaking away to reveal bare steel beneath. Visitors passed it every day, businessmen, students, veterans. Some looked with pride, some looked with shame, but most looked with quiet disbelief, realizing how small it was, how thin its armor, how fragile its frame. Children asked, "Did this really fight against America?" Their parents said nothing, because the truth was not in the metal. It was in the silence that followed. Reflection. Every war leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves behind mirrors, fragments of ourselves, cast in iron and memory. The Type 95 Hago was Japan's mirror. In its birth, it reflected ambition. In its service, belief. In its fall, regret. Now it stands as a reminder of how quickly pride turns to sorrow, and how even the smallest machine can carry the weight of a nation's soul. Narrator, closing line. In the reckoning that followed the war, Japan learned that strength is not in the armor of steel, but in the courage to remember. And as the years passed, the Hago remained, not as a weapon, but as history's quiet confession. Tokyo, present day. A light rain falls over the city. In a quiet museum hall, the Type 95 Hago rests beneath soft white light. Its metal is scarred, faded, and cold, but around it, photographs, diaries, and the silent faces of visitors tell a story larger than any machine could bear. Narrator, calm, reflective tone. Time has dulled the sound of war, but not its echo. What remains of the Hago is not a weapon. It is a memory made of steel, the survivors' letters. In 1972, a Japanese historian named Dr. Kenji Watanabe began collecting letters written by surviving tank crews. Some were short, a few lines on yellowed paper. Others were long, confessional, filled with sorrow and self-doubt. One read, "I used to dream of the Hago roaring through the jungle. Now I dream of silence, the kind of silence that follows when you realize what your life has truly been for." Another said, "When I touched the tank again, I thought it would feel like metal. It felt like memory, heavy and alive." Through those letters, Watanabe discovered something powerful. The story of the Hago was not about victory or defeat. It was about understanding. Across the ocean. In the United States, another kind of remembrance began to take shape. In military museums and veterans' halls, restored Hago tanks were displayed beside Shermans and Stuarts, machines that once faced each other in battle, now sharing the same silence. An American veteran who fought in the Pacific once stood before one of them and whispered, "We were boys, all of us. They fought for their country. We fought for ours. The machine didn't matter, only the men inside it." His granddaughter recorded that moment. Years later, she said she could still hear his voice tremble when he spoke those words. A new generation of engineers. In post-war Japan, as the nation rebuilt itself from ruin, a new generation of engineers emerged. They built trains that crossed islands, cars that changed economies, and robots that reached space. Yet within that innovation, there was always a quiet remembrance, an unspoken promise never to create machines for death again. In a 1985 interview, a retired tank designer who later worked on Japan's first bullet train said, "Every time we heard the sound of the Shinkansen leaving the station, it felt like forgiveness, the sound of steel finally carrying life instead of loss." The Hago in film and memory. By the late 20th century, the Type 95 began appearing in documentaries and films, often portrayed as outdated, almost pitiful. But historians began to push back. They argued that the Hago was more than a flawed weapon. It was a window into a time when Japan believed it could defy the world through willpower alone. It was never just about the tank, said historian Aya Nakamura in 2004. It was about belief. The Hago was built on faith. Faith in empire, in destiny, in honor. And faith, when misled, can be as destructive as any bomb. Her words struck a chord. You could feel the emotion in her voice. Not anger, not blame, but sorrow for how easily pride becomes tragedy. The Forgotten Graves. Deep in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, explorers have found remnants of Hago tanks, still half buried in the earth, their metal fused with roots, their turrets sealed by time. Some still contain human remains. When they are found, the Japanese government quietly arranges repatriation. The remains are wrapped in white cloth and flown home under military escort, not as soldiers, but as sons, finally returning after 80 years. In those moments, the war feels alive again, not in glory but in grief. The camera lingers on the Hago's rusted hull, rain dripping from the barrel like tears. The narrator's voice drops to a whisper. The jungle does not judge, it only remembers. Legacy in the modern world today, the Type 95 Hago lives in classrooms, in textbooks, and in quiet museums across Japan, the US, and the Philippines. To the young, it looks small, fragile, almost toy-like. But to those who know its story, it represents the cost of belief without reflection. In 2023, during a museum ceremony in Tokyo, a child asked his grandfather, "Did you fight in one of these?" The old man smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but it fought for people I once called enemies, and now we share the same peace." The weight of memory. As history fades into documentary footage and textbook pages, one truth remains. The Hago was never about might. It was about humanity, our drive to build, to believe, and to learn too late what we should have known from the start. Every rivet tells a story. Every scar remembers a man's final breath. Every photograph is a fragment of forgiveness. Final narration, slow emotional. Time has no mercy, yet it gives us something war never could, perspective. The Hago was built to conquer, but it endures because it failed. It reminds us that the true legacy of war is not destruction, but remembrance. For as long as that rusted tank stands in silence, we are reminded of what happens when pride overtakes compassion and what grace it takes to begin again. Soft music swells, strings and piano, fading into the sound of rain. The camera pans across the tank, its metal gleaming faintly under museum lights. Narrator, final line with calm resolve. History does not end with victory or defeat. It ends when we finally learn.